Story 1.
Mia's 18th birthday was supposed to be the best night of her life. Her parents rented a cozy little hall just outside of town, filled it with fairy lights and balloons, and invited everyone she loved. The music was loud, the laughter louder, and the smell of freshly baked cake lingered in the air. When it was time to blow out the candles, everyone gathered around, singing loudly and clapping in time with the song. Mia beamed as the cake, glowing with 18 tall candles, was placed in front of her. She leaned forward to make a wish, closed her eyes tightly, and exhaled with all her might. But the flames didn't even flicker. Her friends laughed, teasing her about weak lungs, and encouraged her to try again. This time, she puffed harder, but the flames stubbornly danced back to life. A nervous giggle escaped her lips as someone suggested the candles might be trick ones. Yet, something about the way they burned didn't feel right. The flames seemed too tall, their glow too sharp. "Let me try," her cousin Ben offered, leaning in to blow them out. The moment his breath touched the flames, Mia froze. For a fraction of a second, she saw him vanish. Not just vanish, disintegrate into nothingness. When she blinked, he was back, laughing and pretending to gasp for air as if the candles had defeated him. But Mia's hands were trembling now, and no one else seemed to notice what she'd seen. As the party carried on, Mia couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. Every time she glanced at the cake, the candles seemed taller, their light growing stronger, casting sharp shadows on the walls. "Just blow them out," her mom whispered, nudging her toward the table. Mia swallowed hard and tried again. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and blew with all her might. This time, the room changed. The laughter disappeared, replaced by a low, ominous hum. When Mia opened her eyes, the hall was empty. Chairs were toppled over, the balloons popped and deflated on the floor. The air was cold, freezing, even. Then she saw them, shadows, long and thin, stretching across the walls. They moved, crawling closer to her like living things. Mia stumbled back, her heart pounding as the shadows reached for her feet. "Mia? Are you okay?" a voice cut through the haze. She blinked and found herself back at the party, everyone staring at her. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Yeah, I'm fine," she muttered, forcing a shaky smile. But inside, she was screaming. Something was wrong with those candles, and she had no idea how to stop it. As the night wore on, Mia avoided the cake like it was cursed. She tried to distract herself by chatting with friends and dancing to the music, but her eyes kept darting back to the table. The candles were still burning, their flames unnaturally steady despite the occasional gust of air from the open door. It wasn't until her best friend, Lily, brought up the cake again that Mia felt her pulse quicken. "Why haven't you blown out the candles yet?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. "It's bad luck if you don't." Mia laughed nervously, brushing it off, but Lily wasn't buying it. "Come on, let's just get it over with." Reluctantly, Mia followed her back to the table, every step heavier than the last. The moment Mia approached the cake, the room dimmed. It was subtle at first, but the cheerful twinkling lights overhead began to fade, one by one. The guests didn't seem to notice, but Mia did. And then she saw them, people she didn't recognize standing among her friends. They were dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. She blinked, and they were gone. But Mia knew better now. They weren't gone. They were waiting. Mia's heart raced as she glanced at the clock. It was 11:15. For some reason, she felt like she was running out of time. She needed answers. Dragging Lily aside, she whispered what she had seen, expecting laughter or maybe even a lecture about drinking too much punch. But Lily just stared at her, the color draining from her face. "You're not joking, are you?" Lily whispered. "My grandmother used to tell stories like this. Candles that wouldn't go out, visions of otherworldly things. She said they were warnings. If you don't blow them out by midnight." Lily trailed off, looking genuinely frightened. Mia's stomach twisted. She had less than 45 minutes to figure out how to stop whatever was happening. Desperate, Mia tried pouring water on the candles, but the flames only grew taller. She even tried snuffing them out with her fingers, but the moment she got close, the heat was unbearable. Panic set in as the shadows in the room grew darker, the strange guests reappearing and lingering just out of reach. Mia felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. By 11:40, most of the guests had left, leaving only Mia's closest friends and family. The strange figures were everywhere now, weaving through the crowd like they belonged there. Mia's mom, noticing her distress, tried to comfort her. "Sweetheart, you're just tired," she said softly. "Go blow out the candles, and everything will be fine." But Mia shook her head violently. "They're not normal," she snapped. "Don't you see what's happening?" Her mother frowned, confused, but Lily grabbed Mia's arm. "We need to end this. Now." Together, they returned to the cake, the flames now roaring like tiny bonfires. Lily placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, whispering, "Do it. Just blow them out." As Mia leaned forward, her vision blurred. She saw flashes, her life up to that moment. Her first steps, her favorite birthday party, her father holding her after she scraped her knee. Then the images twisted. Her future was unraveling, no family, no friends, just darkness. It was as if the candles were showing her the cost of failure. With only minutes to spare, Mia made one last attempt. Summoning every ounce of courage, she closed her eyes and blew as hard as she could. This time, the flames flickered but didn't go out. Instead, they changed. The fire turned black, emitting a cold, eerie light that filled the room. The shadows in the corners began to converge, forming into shapes, grotesque, horrifying shapes with too many limbs and empty eyes. Mia screamed, stumbling back as the figures surrounded her. The room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. The largest shadow stepped forward, its voice a guttural growl. "Time," it said simply. "You've had 18 years. Now, it's our turn." Lily tried to pull Mia away, but the shadow was faster. It grabbed Mia by the wrist, its touch icy and paralyzing. "Run!" Mia screamed, pushing Lily back. But Lily hesitated, her eyes wide with terror. The clock struck midnight, and everything stopped. The shadows froze, the flames on the candles dimmed, and the air went still. For a brief, agonizing moment, Mia thought she had won. But then she felt it, a pull, like something was yanking her soul out of her body. She tried to fight it, but it was useless. As the first stroke of midnight echoed, the shadows enveloped her. Mia's screams echoed through the room as she vanished into the darkness. The candles finally went out, leaving the room in complete silence. The guests, those who remained, stared at the spot where she had been, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When the lights flickered back on, the cake was gone, and so was Mia. All that remained was a faint, smoky smell and the overwhelming sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Somewhere, deep in the darkness, Mia's soul was trapped, her 18 years traded for an eternity in the shadows.
Story 2.
It was supposed to be just another birthday party. Eric turned 30, and his friends insisted on throwing him a celebration at his place. The living room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of pizza and cake. Eric wasn't much for grand celebrations, but he loved his friends, so he played along, smiling as they toasted to his milestone year. About an hour into the party, there was a knock at the door. "Expecting anyone else?" asked his best friend, Mark. Eric shook his head, confused. When he opened the door, there was no one there. Just a small, neatly wrapped package on the doormat. It had no name, no return address, just his name scrawled in bold letters across the top. Curious, Eric brought the box inside and opened it. Inside was an old, tarnished pocket watch. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and engraved with strange symbols along the edge. The moment he held it, the watch's hands began to move, ticking loudly. But instead of telling the time, the watch started counting down. "What's it counting down to?" someone asked nervously. Eric shrugged, but something about it made his stomach churn. The ticking grew louder, echoing through the room. Eric set the watch on the counter, trying to ignore it, but his friends couldn't stop staring at it. "It's probably some kind of prank," Mark said, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's counting down to a surprise or something." But Eric wasn't convinced. The watch felt wrong. About 20 minutes later, the first odd thing happened. Sarah, one of Eric's coworkers, went to the kitchen to grab more drinks. She didn't come back. At first, no one noticed. Then someone called out for her, and when there was no response, Eric went to check. The kitchen was empty. No Sarah, no sign she had even been there. Her phone was still on the counter, and the back door was locked. Maybe she left early, someone suggested, but the unease in the room was palpable. Eric called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The watch, now sitting on the coffee table, kept ticking. Each tick seemed louder, heavier, like it was mocking them. An hour passed, and the countdown on the watch showed just under 3 hours left. The party had shifted from lively to tense. No one else had left, and the air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and someone screamed. Eric fumbled for his phone, turning on its flashlight. As the beam swept across the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the corner, just for a moment, was a shadow that didn't belong to anyone in the room. It shifted unnaturally, moving against the light before vanishing. "Did you see that?" Eric whispered, but most of his friends were too panicked to respond. When the lights flickered back on, 2 more people were gone, Mark and Jen. Their drinks were still on the table, their jackets hanging on the back of the chairs. "What the hell is going on?" someone shouted. Eric didn't have an answer. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the watch, louder than ever. By now, the remaining guests were frantic, some demanding to leave. But the front door wouldn't open. Eric tried the windows, nailed shut. It didn't make sense. "This is insane," shouted Lily, one of his childhood friends. "We're trapped." The house began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the corners growing darker, almost swallowing the light. Doors that should have led to familiar rooms now opened to endless hallways. One brave guest tried to run down one of those hallways but never came back. Eric shouted after him, his voice echoing as if the house had expanded into some endless void. The watch showed 2 hours left. Eric picked it up, desperate to stop it, but the hands burned his fingers. "It's the watch," he said, voice shaking. "It's doing this." The others stared at him, fear and disbelief written across their faces. But deep down, they all knew he was right. Eric's mind raced. Who had sent the watch? Why was it doing this? He racked his brain for answers, but nothing made sense. Lily, who was pacing in the corner, suddenly froze. My grandmother used to tell stories about cursed objects, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things that demand something in return. What if the watch wants something? What does it want? Eric snapped, panic rising in his chest. Lily shook her head. I don't know. A soul? A sacrifice? Something to stop the countdown. Her words sent chills through the group. The idea of sacrificing someone made Eric sick, but the watch seemed to pulse in his hand, as if it was agreeing. The remaining guests argued, tension boiling over into shouts and accusations. Some suggested smashing the watch, others whispered about leaving someone behind. Eric clutched the watch tightly, his knuckles white. Nobody's dying tonight, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. With only 30 minutes left, the house descended into chaos. The walls oozed a black, tar-like substance, and the air reeked of rot. Shadows crawled along the floor, wrapping around the ankles of anyone too slow to move. One by one, people disappeared, pulled into the darkness. Eric was left with Lily, both of them cornered in the living room. The watch was counting down its final minutes, the ticking now deafening. There has to be a way to stop it, Eric muttered, his voice trembling. Lily stared at him, tears streaming down her face. I think it has to take someone, she whispered. No, Eric said firmly, but the shadows were closing in. He could feel the weight of the watch in his hand, almost alive, like it was waiting for him to make a choice. Lily grabbed his arm. If you don't stop it, we're both dead, she pleaded. The final seconds ticked away, and Eric knew what he had to do. The watch hit 0. For a moment, everything was still. Then the house erupted into chaos. The walls shook, the shadows screamed, and the floor beneath them cracked open, revealing an endless void. Eric shoved Lily away, holding the watch tightly. Go, he shouted. I'll stop it. No. Lily screamed, but the shadows were already pulling Eric into the darkness. The watch burned brighter than ever, its glow consuming him as the void swallowed him whole. The house went silent, the shadows retreating, the walls returning to normal. Lily was the only one left. She stumbled out of the house, collapsing on the front lawn as the first rays of dawn broke the horizon. Behind her, the house stood still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. In her trembling hand, she held the watch. Its face was blank, its ticking silenced forever.
Story 3.
You know how birthday celebrations in the middle of nowhere are supposed to be fun, right? Anna thought the same when she decided to rent this cozy countryside house for her 25th birthday. It was a perfect plan, good friends, good food, and no neighbors to complain about the music. The evening started great, everyone laughing, dancing, and teasing Anna about her big day. Around 10 p.m., though, something strange happened. There was a knock at the door. Did you invite anyone else? Asked Emily, her best friend. Anna shook her head, confused. When she opened the door, there stood a man, tall, with sharp features in a suit that looked like it belonged in the 1920s. He held a small, black box wrapped in red ribbon. Happy birthday, he said, his voice smooth and cold. No one recognized him, but before Anna could ask who he was, he stepped inside. I insist you open this, he said, handing her the box. The room fell silent as everyone exchanged uneasy glances. Something about him felt off. His smile never quite reached his eyes, and his presence was unsettling. But curiosity got the better of Anna. Anna hesitated, her fingers trembling as she pulled the ribbon. "What's in it?" someone asked, but the man didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. When she lifted the lid, the room seemed to grow colder. Inside was a small, porcelain doll, its face cracked, its eyes staring straight at her. "Is this a joke?" asked Jake, one of Anna's friends, trying to lighten the mood. But the man didn't laugh. He simply said, "Keep it close. It will protect you." His words sent a shiver down Anna's spine. Protect her from what? As soon as the box was opened, strange things started happening. The lights flickered, the music on the speaker distorted, and the fire in the hearth died out suddenly. "This place is old. Maybe it's just the wiring," Emily suggested, trying to calm everyone down. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her. The man lingered, sitting quietly in the corner, sipping a drink no one had offered him. His presence weighed on the room like a dark cloud. Anna's friends tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. Every now and then, they'd glance his way, only to find him already looking at them. Then, more unsettling things began to happen. The doll, which Anna had placed on the mantelpiece, somehow moved to the coffee table without anyone touching it. "Okay, who's messing around?" Jake asked nervously. No one admitted to moving it, and the man just smirked. And then, Anna noticed something horrifying. The man's features were subtly changing. His eyes seemed darker, his fingers longer, his smile more grotesque. When she looked closely, she swore she saw his skin ripple, like something beneath it was trying to get out. By midnight, the mood had shifted entirely. People whispered about leaving, but every time someone tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The windows, which had opened earlier for fresh air, were now sealed shut. "This isn't funny anymore," Emily said, her voice trembling. The man stood suddenly, his movements jerky, almost inhuman. "No one leaves until the gift is accepted," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Anna's heart raced. "I already opened it," she shouted. "What else do you want?" His grin widened, revealing teeth far too sharp for a human. "The gift is not for you to open," he said, his voice deepening. "It is for you to understand." The room seemed to close in, the walls pulsating as if alive. The doll's eyes gleamed under the dim light, and Anna swore she saw it blink. One by one, her friends began to disappear. It wasn't dramatic, no screams, no struggle. They'd just be there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only their belongings. "Jake? Emily? Where are you?" Anna cried, spinning around, desperate to find them. The man watched her panic with amusement. "They've gone where they were meant to go," he said, his voice calm and cold. Anna's chest tightened. "Bring them back," she screamed, but he just shook his head. The doll was now sitting upright on the floor, though no one had touched it. Its cracked face seemed more animated, its lips almost curling into a sinister smile. Anna tried to throw it into the fire, but the flames extinguished the moment it touched them. "You can't destroy what's already chosen you," the man said. Desperate, Anna begged the man for answers. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" He tilted his head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "This isn't about what I want," he said. "It's about what you owe." "Oh? I don't owe you anything," Anna shouted, tears streaming down her face. But the man laughed, a low, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. "The debt was written long before you were born," he said. The gift is a reminder. A warning. And now, it's a choice. The doll began to move, its tiny limbs jerking unnaturally as it stood. What choice? Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. The man leaned in close, his breath cold against her ear. You stay, or they come back. But only one can leave. Anna looked at the doll, then at the man. Her mind raced with memories of her friends, their laughter, their loyalty. Could she really leave them behind? You're lying, she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. But the man's expression told her he wasn't. She clutched the doll, her hands trembling. Fine, she said, her voice breaking. Take me. Let them go. The man's grin widened as he snapped his fingers. The room went dark, and Anna felt the cold wind whip around her. When the lights returned, the house was empty. Her friends were gone, safe and sound, but Anna was nowhere to be found. The doll sat on the mantelpiece, its eyes now eerily familiar, watching over the silent room. The man was gone, but his presence lingered, a chilling reminder of the price Anna had paid.
Story 4.
It all started on her 40th birthday. Margaret wasn't one for big celebrations, so she kept it simple, just a quiet dinner with a few close friends and a glass of wine. The evening was uneventful until the mail arrived, bringing a package from a distant relative she hadn't heard from in years. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no note, just her name scrawled in faint ink. Inside was an old, leather-bound photo album. Its cover was faded, and the binding looked like it could crumble if handled too roughly. At first, she thought it was charming, a nostalgic little gift from someone who knew about her love for family history. As she flipped through the pages, she smiled at the familiar black and white photos of her childhood. But then she noticed something odd. On one of the photos, where she was supposed to be playing alone in her backyard, a shadowy figure stood in the distance. It was faint, like a smudge on the print, but it made her pause. Weird, she muttered, brushing it off as a trick of the light. She closed the album and went back to her guests, leaving it on the coffee table. The next morning, curiosity got the better of her, and she picked up the album again. This time, she paid closer attention to the photos. There were more of them than she remembered, pictures of her at school, on family vacations, and playing with her dog in the park. But now, those shadowy figures appeared in almost every image. They were still blurry, but they seemed closer, like they were stepping forward frame by frame. Margaret frowned, running her fingers over the pictures, trying to understand. Had these always been here? She couldn't recall seeing anyone like that in her childhood. By the time she reached the middle of the album, her unease had grown into full-blown dread. The figures were clearer now, their features starting to take shape. There were 3 of them, a tall man in a hat, a woman with long hair, and a small child holding a stuffed toy. They weren't smiling. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the album was trying to tell her something. She spent hours poring over the photos, searching for any clues. That's when she noticed something even stranger, small, almost imperceptible details that didn't belong. In one photo, the woman with long hair was standing in front of Margaret's childhood home, though Margaret swore she'd never seen her before. In another, the child's stuffed toy was lying on the ground near her feet, even though she never remembered playing with other kids in that park. Her pulse quickened when she noticed the tall man in the background of a picture taken on her 10th birthday. He was leaning against the fence, staring directly into the camera. It was as if he had been there, watching her all along. "This isn't possible," she whispered, slamming the album shut. That night, Margaret's dreams were filled with those figures. She saw them standing at the foot of her bed, their empty eyes fixed on her. The child whispered something, but she couldn't make out the words. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. Determined to make sense of it all, she called her mother the next day. "Mom, do you remember anyone strange being around when I was a kid? Like, people who didn't belong?" Her mother hesitated before answering, "No, honey." "Why do you ask?" Margaret didn't have the courage to explain. Instead, she went back to the album. This time, the figures weren't just in the photos, they were etched into her mind. She couldn't escape them. And then she saw it, a new picture that hadn't been there before. It was her living room, exactly as it looked now, with the three figures standing just outside her window. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the new photo. She turned to the window, half expecting to see them there, but the street outside was empty. "This isn't real. It can't be real," she muttered, pacing the room. But as she flipped through the album again, the pictures began to change. The figures were now inside her house, moving closer with every turn of the page. In one image, the woman stood in her kitchen, her long hair brushing the countertops. In another, the child was sitting on her couch, clutching the stuffed toy. Then she saw herself. In the final photo, she was lying on the floor of her living room, her face frozen in terror. The three figures loomed over her, their eyes now vivid and filled with something sinister. Margaret dropped the album, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. Margaret locked all the doors and windows, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself it was some elaborate prank, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The figures were coming for her. As night fell, strange noises filled the house, whispers, footsteps, the faint sound of a child's laughter. She grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it tightly as she moved from room to room. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak a warning. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She opened the album again, hoping to find some explanation, some way to stop this madness. But the pages were blank now, except for one sentence scrawled in red ink, "They are here." Margaret didn't see them coming. The first figure appeared in the hallway, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. The woman followed, her hair writhing like snakes, and the child brought up the rear, dragging the stuffed toy behind him. She screamed, slashing at the air with the knife, but it was useless. They moved closer, their presence overwhelming, their eyes locking onto hers. "What do you want?" she cried, backing into the corner. The child stepped forward, holding out the stuffed toy. "It's your turn," he said, his voice eerily calm. The last thing Margaret saw was the flash of a camera. When the police found her days later, the album was opened beside her lifeless body. The final photo was of her, sitting motionless on the couch, with the three figures standing behind her, smiling.
Story 5.
Ethan wasn't much for birthdays. At 35, he preferred solitude over noisy celebrations. This year, he decided to stay in, planning to read and maybe watch an old movie. The evening was quiet, just the way he liked it, until the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a delivery man holding a massive, elaborately decorated cake. Ethan frowned. "I didn't order this," he said, but the man just shrugged and handed him the box. "Happy birthday, Ethan," he said, tipping his hat before disappearing into the night. Inside, the cake was stunning, layers of white frosting and delicate decorations. Across the top, in bright red icing, was written, "Happy birthday, Ethan." The writing was precise, almost too perfect. Uneasy but curious, Ethan decided to keep it. After all, who turns down free cake? The house felt unusually quiet as Ethan placed the cake on the dining table. He grabbed a knife and hesitated, the blade hovering over the smooth surface. There was something about the cake that made him uneasy, but he shook it off and sliced into it. As the knife went through, the lights flickered. Ethan paused, glancing at the ceiling, but the flickering stopped. He laughed nervously. "Get a grip," he muttered, pulling out the first slice. It looked normal, moist layers of chocolate and vanilla, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he took the first bite, a faint whisper filled the room. It was soft, almost inaudible, but it was there. "Ethan," the voice was low and drawn out, sending a chill down his spine. He froze, cake halfway to his mouth, and scanned the room. Nothing. Ethan tried to shake off the unease, blaming the whispers on his imagination. He took another bite, but this time, the whispers grew louder, repeating his name over and over. They came from every direction, surrounding him. The lights dimmed, and shadows danced on the walls, their shapes twisting unnaturally. Ethan's breath quickened as he put the plate down. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. There was no response, only the relentless murmurs of his name. Then, the air grew cold. His breath misted in front of him, and the shadows began to converge in the corner of the room. Ethan stared, unable to move, as the darkness seemed to take on a shape, a tall, slender figure that didn't belong. Ethan tried to convince himself it was all in his head. He reached for the knife and cut another slice, hoping the act of eating would ground him. The moment the knife touched the cake, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light was weak, barely piercing the blackness, but it was enough to see the cake. He picked up the slice and took a bite, his hand shaking. The whispers turned into laughter, soft, sinister chuckles that echoed through the room. The darkness around him seemed to move, like it was alive. He felt something brush against his arm, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, until it was almost deafening. Ethan covered his ears, but it didn't help. The darkness began to retreat, revealing the dining room bathed in an eerie, flickering glow. The cake was untouched except for the two missing slices, but the red icing seemed brighter, almost wet. Ethan stared at it, his pulse racing. Then he saw it, the figure from the shadows was standing in the corner. It was closer now, its features clearer. Its face was pale, its eyes sunken and hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. "Ethan," it said, its voice a low growl that echoed in his skull. Ethan stumbled back, knocking over his chair. "What do you want?" he screamed. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing at the cake. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized it wanted him to keep eating. Terrified but compelled, Ethan cut another slice. His hands were slick with sweat, making it hard to grip the knife. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick and heavy. He forced the cake into his mouth, choking on the sweetness. With each bite, the figure grew more solid, stepping closer. Ethan could see its tattered clothing, its skeletal hands, and the way its head tilted unnaturally. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices shouting his name. By the time he finished the slice, the figure was standing directly in front of him. It reached out, its hand icy against his skin. "One more," it whispered, its grin widening. Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face, but he knew he had no choice. Ethan took the final slice, his movements mechanical, like he was no longer in control. As he ate, the figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes boring into his. "Thank you," it said, its voice both grateful and mocking. The room dissolved into darkness, the walls, furniture, and even the cake disappearing. Ethan felt weightless, like he was falling into a void. The last thing he heard was the figure's laughter, echoing endlessly. When the neighbors found the house the next day, Ethan was gone. The dining table was empty, save for a single slice of cake on a plate. The icing still read, "Happy birthday, Ethan." But now, beneath it, a new message was scrawled in red, "See you next year."
Story 6.
James had never been one for big celebrations, but this year, his friends insisted on throwing him a 25th birthday party. To make it unique, they came up with a masquerade theme. "It'll be fun," his best friend Eric had said, slapping him on the back. James reluctantly agreed. By 8 p.m., his small apartment was packed with friends in extravagant masks and costumes. Laughter and music filled the room as people danced, drank, and admired each other's outfits. James even began to enjoy himself, chatting with old friends and feeling a sense of warmth from the lively atmosphere. But about an hour into the party, something strange happened. A man in a plain black mask appeared near the kitchen. James didn't recognize him but assumed he was a +1. The man didn't speak or join the festivities, he just stood there, watching. As the night wore on, more masked figures began to appear. There was a woman in a pale porcelain mask and a tall figure wearing a bird-like beak. None of them joined the party, they simply lingered in the corners, silent and still. James started asking around, but no one knew who they were. "Maybe they're just taking the theme too seriously," Eric joked, but James wasn't laughing. There was something off about them. Their movements were too stiff, their presence too cold. At one point, James tried approaching the man in the black mask. "Hey, are you here with someone?" he asked. The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. James felt a chill creep up his spine as he backed away. Something about those empty eye holes made his stomach turn. By midnight, the mood had shifted. The music seemed quieter, the laughter more forced. The masked figures were no longer in the corners, they were mingling with the guests. Or rather, moving through them. Wherever they went, people seemed to instinctively step aside. James noticed one of them, a woman in a cracked white mask, standing near the drinks table. She tilted her head unnaturally, as if studying him. When their eyes met, James felt a wave of nausea. It was like looking into a void. Then came the whispers. At first, James thought it was just the hum of conversation, but the voices were too faint, too disjointed. "James," they murmured, barely audible over the music. He turned, but no one was there. Feeling unsettled, James pulled Eric aside. "Who are those people?" "The ones in the masks," he demanded. Eric frowned. "I thought they were your friends," he said, but James shook his head. "I don't know them. Something's not right." Eric laughed nervously. "You're just paranoid, man. It's probably a prank." But James wasn't convinced. He noticed that the guests seemed uneasy, glancing at the masked figures and whispering among themselves. A few even began leaving early. James tried to rally the remaining guests, suggesting a group photo to lighten the mood. But as he lined everyone up, he realized with a jolt that the masked figures weren't among them. They were still scattered around the room, watching. The clock struck 1 a.m., and the whispers grew louder. They weren't just saying his name anymore, they were chanting it. "James! James!" The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, making his head spin. Panicking, James turned to confront the figures. "Who are you? What do you want?" he shouted. This time, they responded. Slowly, they moved toward him, their masks glinting in the dim light. Each step seemed to drain the air from the room. Then he saw it, their hands. They were pale and translucent, almost skeletal. And their eyes, visible through the holes in the masks, were empty, black pits. "We've come for you," one of them whispered, the voice echoing like a hollow wind. James ran. He pushed past his friends, who stood frozen in shock, and bolted for the door. But when he opened it, he found not the familiar hallway of his apartment building, but a dark, endless void. He slammed the door shut, his heart pounding. The figures were closer now, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against his arm. James screamed, the cold seeping into his skin like ice. He stumbled back, tripping over a chair as the figures closed in. "Help me," he yelled, but his friends were rooted in place, their faces pale with terror. Only Eric moved, grabbing James and pulling him toward the bathroom. "Lock the door!" Eric shouted, slamming it shut behind them. Inside the bathroom, James was shaking uncontrollably. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. Eric didn't answer. He was staring at the mirror, his face a mask of fear. "James, look," he said, pointing. In the reflection, James saw them, the masked figures standing right behind him. He turned, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figures were closer, their hands reaching for him. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. The last thing James felt was a cold, skeletal hand gripping his shoulder. When the lights came back on, he was gone. All that remained was his mask, lying on the bathroom floor.